Welcome, everyone. Bienvenue à tous. My name is Erin. I'm a second year PhD student in environmental law at U Ottawa, and I have the great pleasure of moderating today's environmental law speaker series. Thank you all so much for joining us. And we're really excited for this timely discussion about planetary health, which is jointly co-hosted by the University of Ottawa's Centre for Environmental Law and Global Sustainability and Centre for Health Law, Policy and Ethics. This session will be recorded for future viewing, so please feel free to turn off your camera if you do not wish to be visible. Cette session sera enregistrée. N'hésitez donc pas à éteindre votre appareil photo si vous ne souhaitez pas être visible. The University of Ottawa and the City of Ottawa, where I am currently joining you from, are located on the unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe, whose presence on these lands dates back to time immemorial. As a settler and a guest on this territory, I want to give thanks and I want to honor the Algonquin Anishinaabe, who are the original environmental stewards and who have respected and protected these life-giving waters, lands, forests, and air for thousands of years. I have an ongoing obligation as a Canadian settler to reflect on what it means to live on stolen land, on how to be in harmonious relationship with other humans and with the more than human world, and on how to engage in meaningful solidarity with Indigenous peoples who have been and continue to be oppressed and face colonial violence for simply existing on their lands. But reflection is really only the beginning. I also have an ongoing responsibility to take action towards reconciliation and decolonization, including by respecting the inherent and treaty rights of all Indigenous peoples, especially the right to self-determination and sovereignty. And I think that these reflections and responsibilities are really important in the context of our discussion today about planetary health. Indigenous peoples around the globe hold worldviews that are rooted in reciprocal relationships with the earth, that recognize and respect this interconnectedness and interdependence of all beings and ecosystems, and that acknowledge a responsibility for collective well-being. So ecocentric approaches to safeguarding the health of our planet and all of her inhabitants are and have existed for thousands of years in Indigenous communities. So in this way, Indigenous land rights could really be considered a determinant of planetary health. And the knowledge, practices, and leadership of Indigenous peoples will be essential to achieving long-term sustainability and health for the planet. So, planetary health. That's what we're here to talk about today. What is it and how do we achieve it? We have Dr. Husein Moloo and Professor Heather McLeod Kilmurray here to provide some clarity on this concept and this very complex challenge. And here's how our session is going to unfold. We're first going to hear from our fantastic speakers in turn, and then we will have time for questions and further discussion. So I would just ask that you please remain muted and use the question and answer or chat functions to pose any questions throughout their presentations. And then when I open it up at the end, I will read these questions out for our speakers and also invite anyone at that point to turn on their microphone to provide further questions or comments. And although the presentations will be in English, please feel free to ask your questions in either English or French. Bien que les présentations soient en anglais, n'hésitez pas à poser vos questions en anglais ou en français pendant la période de questions et réponses à la fin de la session. So now let me introduce you to our speakers. Dr. Husein Moloo is joining us from U Ottawa's Faculty of Medicine, where he was appointed as the Director of Planetary Health last fall, the first position and portfolio of its kind at a Canadian university. Dr. Moloo completed a residency in general surgery at Western University, followed by a fellowship in minimally invasive surgery and a master's in epidemiology at the University of Ottawa. He then completed a fellowship in colorectal surgery at the University of Minnesota and recently graduated with a master's in public health from Harvard. He is a member of the Ottawa Colorectal Group and the current program director for colorectal surgery at U Ottawa. Dr. Moloo has an interest in quality improvement, the organizational architecture to support it, and the various ways functioning infrastructure can be leveraged to improve not only issues such as surgical site infections and readmission, but also issues like decreasing opioid use and reducing our carbon footprint. Dr. Moloo is a very active member in the regional, national, and global medical communities. He is part of the steering committee for surgical quality with Health Ontario, on the board of directors of the Ontario Association of General Surgeons, on the exam executive for the Royal College's General Surgery and Colorectal Surgery exams, president-elect of the Canadian Society of Colorectal Surgeons, and on the editorial board for Diseases of the Colon and Rectum, a leading international journal on colorectal surgery. Moving forward, Dr. Moloo aspires to have global health be a major focus and has been fortunate to become a member of the World Health Organization Collaborating Center for Knowledge Translation and Technology Assessment in Health Equity. Wow, Dr. Moloo, you're incredibly active in your communities, and we're very grateful to you for providing your time today to be here with us. Our second speaker is Professor Heather McLeod Kilmurray. She is a professor at UOttawa's Faculty of Common Law and the founding director and current co-director of the Center for Environmental Law and Global Sustainability. Professor McLeod Kilmurray holds an SJD from the University of Toronto and an LLM from the University of Cambridge. She was a law clerk to Chief Justice Isaac of the Federal Court of Appeal. She practices counsel at Environment Canada and as an assistant solicitor at the Sheffield City Council in England. She is also currently a part-time member of the Ontario Environmental Review Tribunal. Professor McLeod Kilmurray's research focuses on environmental law from a wide variety of perspectives. She has written about procedural barriers to environmental litigation, such as class actions, injunctions, and public interest standing. She also has addressed the role of courts and judges and of environmental ethics on environmental cases. She has written on the issue of GM drift from the perspective of class action litigation, from an ecofeminist perspective, and on issues of environmental justice and the oil sands. Her research also focuses on sustainable agriculture and food policy, and she is the co-author of the first Canadian textbook on food law. Professor McLeod Kilmurray teaches environmental law, torts, legal research and writing, administrative law, and fondement de la common law. So we are honored and very delighted to have you both with us today. And with those introductions, I will now pass the microphone over to you, Dr. Moloo, to get us all better acquainted with Planetary Health.
Okay, is that working? Can you guys hear me? Okay, and you can see my screen. Perfect. This is like one of the main things I was worried about is dealing with these two screens and getting this to work. So first of all, Erin, thank you for that wonderful land acknowledgement and the nice introduction. It is, you know, in a way, it's pretty intimidating to be here. I was reflecting as I was putting together this talk, you know, on the fact that, you know, most of my, actually, I think all of my talks have been within the healthcare sector, and really, I don't know if I've spoken to faculty that is not associated with healthcare directly. And so I think these intersections are really important. I think maybe as people who are involved with the Faculty of Law, these intersections come easier to you because whatever you do, law intersects with so many different things. And I don't know if well, I certainly know for myself, I think it's been a struggle to recognize some of those intersections, and I'll touch on that a little bit today. You know, with these talks, when I give it to people in the healthcare field, they're not necessarily such an engaged and productive group such as yourselves, and so this is the slide where you throw in some ecologic kind of catastrophe, but with you, I know, and I think actually now with most Canadians and most healthcare professionals as well, I don't need to put a picture of anything. You just need to, use your memory and think back to the summer, the fall, the heat dome, the flooding. I mean, anytime you turn on the news now, there is some issue, and I think more and more it becomes apparent to all of us, especially an educated crowd like yourselves, that planetary health is really important. In the spirit of, I guess, pluralism, I thought I would tell you a little bit about myself. Just in terms of understanding the other. I don't know how many times you have to deal with physicians. I did not put this all on, by the way, in an effort to kind of promote that image. I actually, just as luck would have it, got called to just give a second opinion on a case like 10 minutes before we started. So, and in case you're wondering and you're staring at this the whole time, this is Drake on my hat. Drake is the, I mean, he's known as the god of my OR, and I hope I don't offend anyone with that, but he is. So my training, as you heard, started at Western. I did my undergrad there in biochemistry and chemistry. I didn't really learn much actually from that, I have to say, which is unfortunate. But the one thing I took away from it was I took some philosophy, and the teachings of Marcus Aurelius and Immanuel Kant. The lessons from Seneca, Epictetus, etc. Those really stuck with me. The allegory of the cave that Plato and Socrates kind of have a dialogue about. Those are things that I think have guided my thought as I move forward. And I spent 12 years at Western doing my undergrad, followed by medical school, followed by a 5-year residency in general surgery. And then I came to the University of Ottawa, and as you heard, I did a master's in epidemiology and my fellowship in minimally invasive surgery. And then because that wasn't enough, at year, I guess, 14, I went and did a colorectal fellowship at the University of Minnesota, which was a fantastic place to train. Went there for a year, and then I came back. And one of the lessons that I got taught along the way is, and I tell my trainees, and I think it's applicable across disciplines, was one of my mentors told me, every year, do one new thing. And that doesn't have to be a new type of surgery. But it should be something that kind of adds to your toolbox in terms of being able to contribute meaningfully to society. Because for me, really day to day, when I get up in the morning, that's what I want to do. I just want to have a meaningful existence where hopefully I'm adding some positive impact to our community, our world around us. And so that took the form of, let's say, a leadership course, or as an division head. One of those years, it was quality improvement. And so that it's interesting. So I outlined, my educational experience of like 15 years post high school. And when I was handed this portfolio for our division, I really didn't know what to do. And, the whole thing of having a multidisciplinary approach, that was foreign to me. And anyway, I like to think I worked really hard on improving my skills. And I did a kind of this fellowship with the National Patient Safety Foundation around QI and patient safety. And for those of you who don't know maybe what quality improvement and patient safety refers to within surgical domain, it's things like, if you get surgery, you can get infections. How can we reduce that across the board? If you have surgery, you may die from surgery. And so how can we reduce that? How can we reduce people coming back to the emergency department? How can we reduce them requiring another surgery? And so this really appealed to me because although I really enjoyed, my one-on-one, I do colorectal surgery, so I do a lot of colorectal cancer. Doing those surgeries on an individual basis was very meaningful. But in terms of expanding that scope to our division, and then eventually, I kind of led our department of surgery, kind of QI and patient safety. So being able to do that across multiple divisions, working with Health Ontario, stuff like that, it was really meaningful because in some small, tiny way, I could make an improvement in someone's life, whether it was, hopefully their quality of life and their survival, but some tiny piece that I might be able to contribute to that. As I kind of, I was leading the department for a while in that, because I just happened to walk into that as serendipitous time where that portfolio didn't really exist. We began to look at other things that would engage healthcare professionals. So, what things were happening outside that were, bigger than surgery. So the opioid epidemic was obviously one of those things. And we prescribe opioids because people get pain after surgery. And so, we decided to target that. And then, one of the things is, as was mentioned, is started looking at the carbon footprint of surgery, and how we could reduce that and maybe take those learnings and share them with other places. During that time, I could see it was time for that position to be renewed. I had been sitting in it for a while, and as I looked to the future, I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do. So, Harvard had this summer kind of Master's of Public Health program they do over 3 summers. So I thought, there you go. I didn't get as much out of my Master's of Epidemiology as I could have. My second daughter was born. I like to spend a lot of time with her. So I was doing that between like 10 and 2 a.m., most times. And so, I thought, here we go. I can kind of retool myself and hopefully try and move into a different space. And so in doing that, that's when I started thinking about, more global problems. And so one of the things that became very apparent as I had time to think and read and reflect was that, in terms of what planetary health is, at its very basis, it's that if I want to help people be healthy, well, then I should be looking at the planet as well. Because if you don't have clean air, clean water, clean soil, if we don't have thriving ecosystems, you're not going to be healthy. And so it's funny, like, that intersection seems so obvious when you look back at it. But for someone like me, despite, trillion years of being in school, and admittedly, I am a slow learner, this intersection, and actually what's even kind of just to compound that further, talk about biodiversity, one of my best friends led he was the Canadian lead author on the UN Commission on that biodiversity loss, a million species going extinct. And we talk every month. So I really had no excuse. So again, at the basis, what is planetary health? It's just this realization that, for us to have healthy people, we need a healthy planet. And so, how does it affect health? Well, again, it affects things in a number of ways. You can go through every system, whether it's looking at infertility, whether it's respiratory diseases, whether it's infectious diseases. There's intersections with social accountability. We know that people with low or middle, like human development index, those people are disproportionately affected. And even within our country, people of lower socioeconomic status are disproportionately affected. You look up at the top towards the north, it talks about availability of traditional foods in the north, impacts on mental health. I think those impacts on mental health are actually, those are not just in the north. I think we all sense that. For me, I would say to some degree, for sure, one of the things that I think drove me into this sphere was eco-anxiety. And it's that worry about what's going on, and that sense of, the people that are supposed to be agents for change are not driving change, and almost sitting like a helpless kind of bystander. And that eco-anxiety was definitely part of my story, and trying to turn that eco-anxiety into eco-action. And so, we know that the health of the planet has an effect on health of people, and it has an effect on the healthcare system. But then there's this other piece. And for me, again, I have a fairly simple mind. There's two main buckets. So the first is, again, the planet, like the health of the planet having an effect on the health of individuals and on the healthcare system. But then the whole notion that the healthcare system actually has a massive effect on the planet. And so when you look at the healthcare system, one of the most eye-opening statistics for healthcare professionals, and you guys are probably aware of this already, but if you took healthcare as its own entity, we would be the 5th largest country, right behind Japan, in terms of our carbon footprint. You may go, it's crazy, but you think about what a big industry healthcare represents. You look at one simple area like the operating room, you look at the instruments we use, are they disposable or not? I can tell you, every gown in the OR right now at the Ottawa Hospital is disposable. So you start looking at this, the anesthetic gases, people coming for their visits, and you very quickly get a sense of, why healthcare has this gigantic carbon footprint. And so, what can we start doing about this? Well, again, I have to really, credit the dean and vice dean at the University of Ottawa Faculty of Medicine for having the vision to create a role like the Director of Planetary Health. And certainly, one of the things that we can really think about when talking about, the planet, the health of the planet having an effect on the health of people is educating them. So again, Faculty of Medicine is responsible for, undergraduate medical student education as well as graduate education. And, before planetary health or, the climate crisis, et cetera, was taught as like a, 1-2 hour standalone lecture in the entire, 4-year curriculum. And again, kudos to the people at the Faculty of Medicine. We really advocated for including this longitudinally. So to, again, draw on these intersections that are occurring, with every organ system and with different important issues like social justice, and include this longitudinally. And that's what's going to happen. And that's exciting. But, again, like you talk about, we have postgrads, so the residency programs and fellowship programs that exist under the Faculty of Medicine umbrella. But then you get out to, practicing physicians who, again, don't have a lot of education about this. I did not have a lot of education about this. I've been desperately reading stuff so I can, at least articulate some kind of understanding and then create some kind of vision and mission from that. And so that's where, we're trying to create partnerships with the Royal College of Physicians and Surgeons. Can we talk to accreditation bodies for medical schools, for hospitals, to say these things need to be included as part of the standards? It is no longer okay to like put this off for another couple of years, because 2030 is coming pretty quickly. And it's same in the Royal College, as was mentioned in that intro, which was far too long. I sit on this executive. We put together the exams for like the general surgery residents, and I can't test them on Planetary Health unless it's in the standards from the Royal College. And so those are some of the things that I think we need to do to start ameliorating this problem and making people more aware. Because at the end of the day, what we really need, in whether it's an acute care hospital setting, whether it's a home care setting, whether it's a long-term care setting, is for every healthcare practitioner to be thinking about, the consequences of their action, or when the hospital decides to get something, what has been the carbon footprint of that. And that really needs to be part of decision making that's made day to day. So this framework, one of my mentors in this area, she's much younger than me, as you're gaining from my talk here, from how many years I was in school, and I'm in my 14th year of practice now, so I'm pretty old, so I'm older than a lot of people. But she's Andrea McNeil, who's a surgeon actually out in BC, and she put together this framework, kind of talking about prevention, appropriateness, the circular economy, and then in a paper we wrote together, we also talked about embedding sustainability. And so practically, like when you're talking to healthcare professionals, I thought I'd give you kind of a glimpse of maybe what those things look like. So colorectal cancer, right? I mean, I care a lot about that. So this is a picture of a colonoscopy and a polyp being removed. And we, for the majority of colorectal cancers, for all of them, they usually start as a small polyp. And if we can remove the polyp, well then, you hopefully don't end up with colorectal cancer. You don't end up seeing me and requiring, potentially chemotherapy, radiation, surgery, along with its, length of stay, maybe the complications of it, maybe the readmission, etc. That has a much bigger carbon footprint versus ensuring we have a good screening program through, let's say, FIT testing, which is a stool test, and quality colonoscopy, where these polyps are removed ahead of time. So that's the whole notion of kind of prevention. The other way of prevention, I included this because Andrea texted me this. This is a paper that I wrote with some of my fellows here around, like looking at things preoperatively. So even if someone makes it to needing surgery, in the past, I'll tell you, like the way I look at things now is much different than before, in terms of like if someone had a low hemoglobin, so that's kind of like their blood level heading into surgery, to be honest, we didn't really care that much. I know that sounds crazy, but we didn't. And there was lots of evidence to show that, guess what? You don't have to be in medicine to realize that if someone comes in with a lower hemoglobin level, well, guess what? Their complications are worse. Their length of stay is worse. Their readmission is worse. Their, everything is worse. And so, we've kind of worked on trying to optimize people before, again, trying to prevent problems. And, we just submitted a paper just on anemia recently. And what we found in a before-after study in terms of implementing, correcting anemia or trying to correct anemia, just even trying to correct it before surgery, it's like a $9,000 savings per patient. So that's like, that's significant. And when you look at that, the intensity of care and the cost of care, not all the time, but the vast majority of the time, falls the carbon footprint. So if you're saving that money, and we found that readmissions were less, complications were less, that has a lower carbon footprint. So in terms of reframing things like a Stoic would, I think all this stuff plays into decreasing our carbon footprint. For a lot of healthcare professionals, I think it's reframing all the great work they're doing, but really starting to frame it around planetary health. And there's opportunities everywhere. I have a picture of an anesthetic bottle there. Our anesthetists have done a fantastic job here at really trying to reduce the use of some really kind of almost gases that have it's like 4,000 or 40,000 times the impact of carbon dioxide. So big things like that. There's virtual care. Virtual care not only in terms of decreasing the visits that people have to make appropriately. Like sometimes we need to see people and people want to be seen in person. But there's the whole other thing. Like one of the interesting studies we did was around interviews. So we have this interview process when people go from medical school to residency, and they fly around the country to pick what they want to do. So we looked at that and we found that the average general surgery candidate had it was 1.8 tons of carbon dioxide. So you'd say okay, well, per person, that's not very much. But, when you put that in perspective, the average person in India per year uses half a ton. And so, we talk about colonialism, we talk about, the way that people who are lower on the pole socioeconomically kind of suffer because of our actions. And we who are very privileged, I think, have a responsibility to start acting on stuff like that. But interestingly, I've done some surveys and it's still more than half the people would still love to return to in-person interviews. And, as a program director of colorectal surgery, for example, we're not going to do that. We're going to stay virtual and everyone else can go in person. Good for them. The thing in the middle there, it says right, it's actually the end of that word, it's right facts. The hospital has technology for so the hospital, some places tend to be pretty archaic. We were one of them. So we had paper faxes. In fact, in the Department of Surgery, pretty much all the surgeons had paper faxes. And this technology existed to make it electronic. My office, for example, when we look at a year, we used 50,000 sheets of paper. So again, reducing paper or whatever, but all these things cumulatively can have an impact. And it was one of the urologists who led this initiative. And our whole Department of Surgery, all the surgeons' offices essentially now have switched over to electronic faxing. So again, I think there's these opportunities that we have to really drive kind of think about the health of the planet, regardless of the setting. It doesn't have to be in the operating room, although that's some of the examples. It doesn't have to be before surgery, although that's some of the examples. It's really anything that we can look at and try and optimize. When we talk about appropriate care, this figure, $100 billion, is the amount of money that gets wasted in the US every year on inappropriate care. And, it's interesting because when you look at, COP26 and the fund that they wanted to have to actually, move to more carbon neutral solutions, that's $100 billion. And that's just looking at one sector. So again, you look at appropriate care, what does appropriate care look like? Well, following the evidence. If I bring it back to colorectal surgery, because, well, hey, I've got to, I'm a colorectal surgeon. Removing a polyp endoscopically is much better than taking someone to surgery. It just has a much better carbon footprint. Are all surgeons doing that? No, they're not. Can we educate them about that? Yeah, we can. And so, these are things that we can work on through provincial guidelines, et cetera, to try and drive some of this change. But again, are something that may be a little bit, more of a contentious topic is our end-of-life care. I mean, putting people on third, fourth line, chemotherapy for 3 weeks more of life, which may be of poor quality because we're afraid to have that conversation about death. We're not immortal, and as a Stoic would say, every time you look behind you, death is there. And so I think we have to get comfortable with that. We have to get comfortable with these conversations because a lot of healthcare is put into those last few weeks of life. And in terms of other appropriate care, I know Heather's going to talk, and much more eloquently than I will, about food. But I thought to tie our talks together, one of the things is in the hospital, why is it that we have mainly a meat diet? It makes no sense to me at all. It is very clear that we can give people nutrition having more of a vegetarian-based diet in hospital. yet that doesn't happen. And food waste is a big thing. 50% of the food that's given in hospital gets wasted. And so I just thought I'd show you this little video. I hope it works. Please shout out to me if it doesn't.
Oh, my sweet baby, I'll travel the world for you. I love you.
Can we get strawberries?
No, honey.
Please.
Okay.
Okay, I hope that came through okay. But again, it's these intersections that exist, like I said, with healthcare that I'd never really thought about before, but have massive effects. And so really important for, again, when we think about appropriate care prevention, these are all things I think healthcare professionals and hospitals really need to think about. And then there's this whole idea of circular economy. And again, I think this comes down to the way we procure stuff. We know that when you look at the carbon footprint of a hospital, the procurement piece is like in most studies somewhere between like 45 to 60%. So it's big. And again, I think procurement of food, but it's also all the instruments, let's say for the OR, the disposables, where do they come from? What does that supply chain and value chain look like? Is that a part of our decision making right now? No, it really isn't. And so again, this is where, again, policy driving these kinds of things, I think is really, really important. In terms of embedding these things, as I bring it back to where I started in quality improvement, generally the equation that I used for quality was basically you improve the outcome for the patient as the numerator, and the denominator was economic cost. And that was it. I'll be honest. That's very simply, that was it. And if you improve the outcome, you decrease the cost. Guess what? That's quality improvement. I think that really needs to shift now. This is the sustainable QI model, and it embeds sustainability as a core value. And when we look at the equation for quality improvement in healthcare, instead of it just being outcomes over economic cost, we also have to look at the environmental impact and social accountability. And I think if we're able to start, one of the things we're trying to work on is every healthcare professional is now more and more getting trained in QI. Being trained in quality improvement is a standard for the Royal College. So by educating people around this type of model, we're really hoping maybe that'll embed some of these values and thoughts as people do day-to-day things in terms of QI. And finally, one thing I'll tell you I'm struggling with right now is, in QI, I always used to love this very Canadian example, is that, in hockey, you ultimately want to score goals to win a game. And to score goals, you need to take shots on goal. And for us, originally when I started in QI, we didn't we didn't really have that infrastructure. So we didn't have the team to take shots on goal. And that's kind of one of the main things that I'm really proud of, which we kind of built, was that infrastructure for like continued yet iteration on different things to be able to use, PDSA cycles, et cetera, to continue to drive change. So we had that infrastructure. With a wicked problem like Planetary Health, I'm not sure kind of what that infrastructure looks like. And that's one thing I'm certainly kind of struggling with right now to come up with, I guess it depends on the situation, obviously, but I'll tell you, that's one thing I constantly kind of think about. One of the things which I think Heather and Thomas and Erin are much better than me at already is thinking about this slide, although it's all blurry. Back at the time of the Renaissance in Europe, I'm sure a lot of you have heard about the Medici family, and they were located in Florence, and really a lot of the some people think that the Renaissance in Europe really started there, and the reason why is because they had people from all sorts of different disciplines getting together, finding these intersections, and making really great and interesting things happen. This article here that I'm referring to is in the Harvard Business Review, is about change agents within the National Health Service in the UK. And what they talk about is that this bridging network was much more common for effective change agents as opposed to a cohesive network where, you just kind of, the people around you, but, you don't, like the bridging network people, they knew people in all sorts of different areas. And, I have to say, I want to, again, thank Thomas and Heather for inviting me, because I didn't reach out to them. They reached out to me originally. They're the ones who invited me here to kind of create this dialogue, to hopefully start looking at these intersections. And we need to look at these intersections very quickly, because 2030 is not too far away. As that friend of mine who wrote that UN report, at the bottom of his emails, he has this quote which sticks in my head from Marshall McLuhan, and that's on, it's on Spaceship Earth, there are no passengers, we are all crew. And I think through meaningful dialogue like this, through these things that you guys are setting up, that's what gives me hope in terms of, turning that eco-anxiety into action. And I really want to thank you all for giving me the opportunity to talk to you today. So thank you.
Thanks very much, Dr. Moloo. We really appreciate that overview of planetary health and some of the specific actions that can be taken to incorporate it into the healthcare sector, and as well as some of those opportunities that exist, not only, I guess, for the healthcare system to be responsive to the increasing health impacts of climate change and environmental pollution, but also to be a part of the solution in really improving planetary health by becoming more lower carbon and more climate resilient, I guess is another word we could use. And as well, I found it really, really great to hear about how the Faculty of Medicine is taking initiative to include planetary health in their curriculum. I think it's something that's really important as well for us to think about at the Faculty of Law. And I also just want to thank you for sharing so open and honestly about the ways that planetary health, that our planetary health crisis is impacting your personal mental health. I think it's really important for those of us who are working on the solutions and constantly analyzing the problems to talk about this. It's very emotionally challenging work, and we need to both take care of ourselves and support one another, and so that we can continue to show up with the energy that we need to really work towards collective solutions in betterment of the health and well-being of the planet and in turn ourselves. So thank you again so much for all of your words. And I will now pass the microphone over to Professor McLeod Kilmurray to speak a little bit more about food and health and perhaps some of the policy and legal solutions that are available as well.
Thank you so much, Erin, for the wonderful introduction and the land acknowledgement. I really appreciated that. And thank you also, Husein, for such a fascinating presentation. And we talk about interdisciplinarity a lot, and we've done a little bit, but I certainly have never been on a panel where polyp surgery was part of the discussion. So this is truly breaking ground in terms of interdisciplinarity, but it's exactly as Dr. Moloo said, it's all interconnected. And so I'm an environmental lawyer, and as part of some of our environmental research, we started looking at sustainable food systems. And over the past 6 or 8 years, food law has become an area of research and practice in Canada, and it's growing rapidly. So we're very excited about it. And I think it's very, very closely connected to planetary health. As my colleague, Professor Sarah Berger-Richardson says, food is the place where humans interact, directly with the environment 3 times a day. So this is something very impactful in both directions. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about the problem with unsustainable food systems, and then hopefully some suggestions for win-wins and some of the ways in which legal law and policy are creating the problem, and also some ways in which they're starting to move toward helping a little bit. So today I'm not going to be talking about Indigenous legal traditions and Indigenous food systems. There are many different Indigenous legal structures and systems and many different Indigenous foodways operating on this land that we currently call Canada. And so this could be a whole other discussion, and hopefully will be. Again, we've talked about it a little bit in past speaker series, but I just wanted to acknowledge that that's a huge area that we can learn a great deal from, but I won't be addressing that today. And I recommend this book by my colleague, Professor Priscilla Settee, for those who are interested. So this was in the Lancet. So this is, of course, connecting us to medical health, et cetera, and planetary health. And so in this article about the planetary diet in the Lancet Journal, they said that, the bad news is that the way we're currently producing food has huge footprints and harms for the planet. But the good news is that fixing our global food system is the single strongest lever to improve human health and planetary health. So I think that's, exciting to look at it from that perspective. There is a lot of law and policy out there around the food system and sustainable food. So Canada is a party to many international agreements. We recognize a human right to food internationally, even though we haven't put that into place at the domestic legal level. We're signatories to lots of climate, biodiversity agreements, the SDGs, finally to UNDRIP, and also to the recent UN Declaration on the Rights of Peasants. And there is a growing awareness in the law and policy areas of the importance of the food system to many different dimensions. So the federal government is trying to develop law on zero emissions. It's important to make sure that they actually consider the food system as part of that. Also with the single-use plastics. There's a lot of recent legislation and new national food policy. We've never had one before. Now we finally have one at the federal level. The new Canada Food Guide has brought in a lot of changes. In Ontario, we're starting to create legislation on a circular economy, as Dr. Moloo referred to. There's also a food and organics waste framework, so dealing with food waste a little bit finally at the law and policy level in Ontario. But there's a lot of remaining issues. So just speaking about the Sustainable Development Goals, I mean, people say, well, number 2 is zero hunger, but in fact, fixing the food system would help us to tackle nearly every single one of these goals. Life on land, life below water, responsible consumption and production, etc. Even education, right? As Dr. Moloo was talking about, teaching doctors about sustainability, teaching law students. Environmental law is not a mandatory course here as it is in some other jurisdictions. And also for people to have food literacy, right, as citizens is really important. So all of these goals are linked to the food system. I think pretty much nearly every single one of them. And so, yeah, the Lancet report, it's called Our Food in the Anthropocene, is the paper that we're talking about. And they say that in order to achieve human health improvement, but also sustainability, the global food system must operate within the boundaries for both. So if we look, we teach this in environmental law a lot. This is the Rockstrom paper on planetary boundaries. And you can see the areas in red. Those are areas where we're in some trouble. And so biochemical flows, particularly nitrogen, that's very closely involved with food production. Land systems change, so cutting down forests to grow grasses for livestock, right? Genetic diversity is very much affected by monocropping in food production, and by a reduction in the biodiversity of the kinds of animals and plants that we tend to eat in the globalized food system. And the good news is that we can bring these back down, right? So if you look at the one on the ozone layer, for example, I'm sure if we looked at this 20 years ago, it probably would have been up in the red, and now it's not. So it is possible to reverse these systems, but we're talking about developing a food system that operates within these boundaries. And so Professor Moloo gave you the punchline earlier. So this is a thing, food waste is a problem that people are becoming increasingly aware of. But the scope of it, I think, is still not fully understood. And so not only, I mean, when you talk to policymakers, maybe you talk about the money, right? $31 billion, they like to hear about that. But of course, it also wastes all the inputs, as we saw from Dr. Moloo's excellent video. And the food waste in itself produces methane gases, which are 25 times stronger climate change gases than carbon dioxide. And so this is a thing that we have been unused to. As I said, many countries are starting to tackle this. They even are starting to talk about it at the Paris agreements and the United Nations climate change COPs only recently. But one of the things that's interesting is that the way the global food production system is designed incentivizes this waste, right? So talking about having strawberries flown across the planet because certainly in the global north, we feel entitled to have every single food option available to us at every second, right? It's necessary for us to be allowed to have a pineapple in the middle of January if we want to. And so a lot of these systems are, for example, during the COVID crisis, there was a lot of difficulties in, for example, abattoirs, because of the close, and again, my colleague, Professor Sarah Berger-Richardson, has written a lot about this. So there was a slowdown at the abattoirs, which means the animals were backed up and they produced them so quickly to be on this constant system of greater and greater, faster and faster production to produce cheaper and have constantly available food that some ended up killing their animals because they were so backed up in the system, because it's just so focused on constant production. And so there are structures that sort of lead to food waste. The other thing is diets. And again, this relates directly to human health, as Dr. Moloo was saying. And so I think we're aware of this, just the carbon intensity of eating this is part of why many different people from the medical community, from the legal community, from the environmental communities are talking about changing the diet to reduce the consumption of things which, interestingly, most of the time in most sort of ecosystems are worse for human health are also the things that are worse for planetary health. And this is also an issue of food justice, both intergenerationally and intragenerationally. So if we look at the feed conversion ratio, in order to produce meat, it requires a lot more resource inputs than it does to produce other types of food, like pulses and vegetables in most ecosystems. Of course, there's a varying, whether you live in the far north, whether you live at the equator, of course, there's going to be differences. But as a general rule, the ratio of energy input for industrially produced meat can be as high as 35:1. So that's not an efficient use of planetary resources, which causes food injustice, but it's also a system that we have that is increasing meat production and increasing meat consumption around the world. These are just some more statistics, right? The American diet would only feed 2.5 billion people. And also, if you look at the soy, for example, half of the soy produced in the US and more than half the corn is fed to domestic livestock, and the rest is exported to livestock facilities elsewhere. And as we know, livestock are not designed to eat soy and corn, right, which causes difficulties in terms of quality, et cetera. And all of this excess production and and subsidized types of production, for example, of corn, produces excess corn. And this is then fed to the animals, which made it reasonable and cheaper to start producing meat industrially rather than in a traditional farm where, for example, the animals were sort of in a symbiotic relationship with a small farmer that had a variety of crops and some livestock, where their waste, for example, was part of the nutrients for the soil. And that was a sort of small circular economy on a small scale farm. And now at the industrial level, apart from the treatment of the animals, the waste is an enormous problem in the methane emissions, et cetera. So it's just not, it's a system that's designed and has evolved to be more environmentally harmful and perhaps also not so good for humans. So I'm just going to move forward because we're running out of time. So this is an example of a win-win. It just illustrates the point I made earlier that there's a tendency in most ecosystems for most eaters, and of course there's variation, that what's at the bottom of the food pyramid is the best for human health, and those same foods are at the bottom of the environmental period upside down because they have the lowest footprint. So creating policies to incentivize this planetary diet is good for both. And you're seeing in other countries, for example, the national food guides are actually saying things like, try to eat foods that are good for you and the planet. Right, so they're actually linking these two things together within national food guides, which is very exciting. So it provides a bit of hope. Oops. It doesn't seem to want to move forward now for some reason. I'll just try to do that again. So I'll just very quickly talk about some law and policy. As you can see, this again, some optimistic things. The recently revised National Food Guide does recommend this half plate of fruits and vegetables, and only 25% in terms of protein. And within that, you can see while meat is still there, it is a reduced emphasis on that. So that shows that policymakers are becoming aware of this. But how do we make these changes? So there's legislation, we can pass legislation, we can add, carbon tax to the food systems, which should incentivize foods with lower carbon footprints. And that includes meat, which in Canada, because of very rigorous food safety standards, we have highly concentrated and centralized abattoirs that require meat to travel hundreds or thousands of kilometers to get to an abattoir, greatly increasing their carbon footprint as well as animal suffering. And so the carbon prices can have effects on that, for example. But apart from that, we also have to look at these other aspects of law and policy tools. For example, subsidies to the food sector. So you can see here in a fairly recent article that,
Okay, Heather's frozen for me. I'm assuming.
Yeah, for me too, Erin.
Okay, I can see a couple.
Me too.
Yeah.
Or encourage meat alternatives.
Heather?
Yes.
We lost you there for about 30 seconds. You froze.
Okay.
So if you could just go back a tiny bit.
Okay.
Yeah, wonderful. Thanks.
So I was just mentioning about while there is some legislation and we're getting awareness of the policy, there are these subsidies that work to the contrary. Right. And so could we, just like for oil in the energy sector, could we redirect these subsidies towards more sustainable approaches to food production? For example, there are alternatives to meat, right? Plant-based alternatives that some people are interested in exploring. But as our former PhD student and now professor, Angela Lee, has written about, there's lots of legal barriers to the introduction of plant-based alternatives as well. And so can the legal system, step out of the way or try to incentivize some of these more sustainable alternatives to, and again, I want to emphasize, I'm talking about industrially factory farmed meat, not all meat. There are places in the prairies, for example, there are grasslands that if they don't have ruminants eating on the grasslands, that the grasslands themselves will not survive, and they're host to great biodiversity. So there are certainly sustainable meat production methods, but the industrial factory farmed meat production method is a significant problem. and brings about, going back to medicine, the need for, antibiotics and all kinds of other things because of that production system where they're also closely crammed in, that transmission of disease becomes a risk, and that also affects human health. So again, keeping all of these things in mind when we think about these kinds of subsidies and legal systems is important. Again, on this same issue, that our laws on animal transport are very lax in Canada. And so that's a sort of indirect subsidy to the industrial meat production approach. It's not, the animal cruelty laws in Canada don't apply to animals farmed for food, as they do, for example, to human pets, because the test for cruelty is you're not allowed to inflict unnecessary cruelty. But because the industrial meat system has become normal, that is necessary cruelty, and therefore the laws don't apply. So all of these kinds of laws and regulations are part of the legal system that creates these incentives or these structures that make this unsustainable food system seem to make sense. And so again, this is a very long presentation, so I'm not going to go into all of this. I'm trying to indicate that there's so many different areas of law that currently disincentivize sustainable food systems, but could be transformed into drivers toward more sustainable food systems. And so these are just some examples of trade law. How could trade law, for example, a paper was written by civil society groups for the European Union, showing them specifically how they could use their trade law negotiations to include more sustainable food production as part of it within trade law. Competition laws are such at the moment that massive multinational corporations have enormous amounts of power over the food system. So that's another reason why we tend toward the growing power of the global industrialized food system. Corporate law, all of these things, intellectual property law, which allows people to own seeds and own the very sources of food and life. These are all matters, and it goes all the way through down to municipal law, right? During the pandemic, the farmers markets and community gardens were shut down out of fear of the pandemic, and it required a great deal of activism on the part of civil society organizations at the municipal level to have those declared essential services, so that everyone wasn't just diverted to the major grocery stores as a result of COVID, that we could continue with local and regional food systems if that was a choice that people wanted to make. So overall, I think the message is that the food system, there's so many opportunities to reduce food waste, to encourage through law and subsidies and other policy tools, more sustainable food production systems, and to disincentivize those that are more harmful, both to the planet and to human health. So I'll stop there because I want to make sure we have lots of time for questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Heather, for this really fantastic window into the planetary health impacts of the food system, and for presenting some encouraging and hopeful possibilities for interdisciplinary solutions, and as well for really making us think about how so many different areas of the law have a role to play. I think it's great that your presentation flowed really well from Dr. Moloo's in highlighting these links between human health and the health of the environment, and how using law and policy to make our food systems more sustainable is going to positively impact both. So these win-wins, as you called them, and also that we can simultaneously address many social injustices as we are tackling the food system as well. So thank you both again very much for your engaging and generative talks. And I will now open up our question and answer and discussion period. So if you would like to ask a question, please feel free to either type it into the chat and I'd be happy to read it out to our speakers, or alternatively, if you want to raise your hand or just go ahead even and unmute yourself, feel free to ask the question directly to our panelists. Great. So Gail has asked, Gail has made a comment just about how interesting this presentation was and that she'd appreciate a list of references from both the presenters. So wondering whether we might be able to send out either the presentations themselves or a list of references that were used in the presentations. I imagine we can do that to everyone who registered. Yes.
Yeah, and I have a whole bunch of, I don't know, I kind of think of it as a starting package around planetary health. And kind of the different intersections, as you know, we talked about kind of social justice and equity, and I'll send that to you. There's a bunch of articles there, but they're really interesting. So I'll send those to you, Erin. And
yeah, that would be wonderful.
Okay.
We'd love to circulate that. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Okay. So we have another question. What is the greatest role universities can play in moving forward on sustainability initiatives? Heather, would you like to start? I can see you nodding excitedly about this question.
I see Husein as well. And it's nice to hear that from Jonathan, who is the captain of sustainability and has been for so many years here at Ottawa U, that does such an amazing job at the sustainability office of our university. Well, I think Dr. Moloo mentioned just education. You know, I think that embedding this within legal studies obviously would be a good thing, even though that might be sort of self-promoted. But it's very few areas of law, as I mentioned, that don't touch on sustainability. Maybe family law, maybe it wouldn't be essential, but so many other criminal, trade, corporate, international. So I think embedding sustainability across some of the curriculums and maybe working more collaboratively on how to do that would be interesting. But and then, just like Dr. Moloo was saying, in terms of the medical profession thinking about its own footprint, I think Jonathan does it at the central level, but for each faculty really to make more effort in terms of our own footprint would be something useful. Dr. Moloo?
Yeah, no, thanks for that question. I think those are great comments that Heather's made already. I think, if I take a step back, and maybe it's just where I am right now, because my daughter is 17 and she's applying to university right now. My younger daughter's 15. And when we talk about universities and university education, there's been this almost like a criticism of is it promoting the values that we've always kind of expected from these institutions? But, I can think of no better place, and maybe if I had more thought, I'd maybe be able to think of a better place. But, when we think about moving things forward, when we think about the ideas of, pluralistic thought, or if we try and inform our decisions through, epistemological pluralism, what better place is there than a university where you have all these people who are so passionate about their different areas, whether it's, visual arts or psychology or law or medicine. And to me, again, I think these really kind of game-changing things tend to happen at intersections. And what better place there than university for that? So, things like this. I think for me, and Jonathan was kind enough to chat with me a few times at least already as I look for direction. And he's done incredible stuff, but I think that's one of the things he tries to do is pull everyone together to have these conversations, and I think that's really what a university can do in terms of getting more people on board.
Great. Thank you so much for giving us so many different initiatives to think about. The next question, I think I'll go to Professor Simons. I see your hand up there. If you'd like to ask your question.
Yes, thanks, Erin. Thanks, Dr. Moloo and Heather for your great talks, and Erin for your great introduction. It's been a great way to spend an hour and a half, or almost an hour and a half. I just wanted to ask, because I have looked at this issue from a trade law, transnational corporate activity perspective a number of years ago. And, the whole trade system with respect to food is set up based on this industrial production or industrial agricultural production. So I wondered, how are we going to, what's the answer? Is the answer, we can't go back to subsistence farming. Like, do we turn to some sort of smaller, more local, sustainable farming? And how do we do that in a way that still allows, say, countries that make a lot of cash, that funds a lot of their program, of their infrastructure, et cetera, and government on exports of food? There's a whole kind of north-south issue here as well. And so how do we do that in a way that's going to allow countries and communities to become sort of food secure and remain food secure? It's a complicated question.
First, Heather.
Okay, no, it's a very difficult question. I mean,
sorry.
No, it's a good question. It's an absolutely good question. And I think that, like, exactly what we've been saying, no one person knows how to answer that. So this interdisciplinarity is so huge, right? It's so important. Tackling food waste, I think, is a big one. And that would reduce a lot of, the environmental footprint of the food system, and without obviously reducing people's access to food, because it's literally being wasted. But so I've heard so many different varied views on this in various conferences and panels on food law lately. Some people say that what would be nice is, particularly in the global south, to ensure that countries are sort of able to feed themselves with their basic needs and then export the excess, so that it's sort of an exported model of food production, and a relatively recent one. I think that's what's so fascinating, is how relatively recent this globalized food system is. And so it's not to say that we should never trade food, and that that's new. Of course, we've been doing that for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. But this idea that we have a food system where, international trade law, for example, has resulted in, in some instances, people in China buying rice from the United States because it's cheaper. How can that possibly be, right? And so those are some trade rules that clearly don't make sense, and that disempower the global south. So, there are things about the green revolution that people can debate. Certainly saving people who are on the verge of death from starvation is extremely important. And so there's lots of wins as a result of that. But there's lots of people saying that over the long term, the green revolution, with its strong emphasis on chemical inputs and industrialization and moving toward monoculture for food export, has not necessarily benefited those who were most in need. So I think, it's such an interesting conversation. But I do think, I've heard a government minister say the fact that climate change is making it so much more difficult to grow food in the global south is a great opportunity for Canada. And I thought, that can't be the correct way to look at this problem, that because the industrialized north is causing climate change, and so some countries can't produce their own food, we can export more, So having a food justice, a right to food lens, to maybe soften some of these more egregious problems, I think would be a good place to start.
So I'm going to have nothing as close to as good an answer as that. What I can tell you from a very simplistic mindset is that, to me, a couple stats that really stick out is that for us to continue to devour what we do in the global north would require, I think, 7 planets. And we have enough food right now to feed everyone on the planet. And so again, it does take a multidisciplinary approach. If we're going to shift things at the hospital as a microcosm of that, for example, that would take policy change. It would take, you showed that kind of food donut, the whole notion of like donut economics that Kate Raworth talks about. I think I think we do need to make, radical shifts in the way we approach things. And like I said, in healthcare, there's no reason why we have to offer meat as the main ingredient to pretty much every meal that's offered to people. Mm-hmm. And so again, I think I think these are kind of conversations that we're going to have, right? And one of the things actually, before I forget, because I tend to forget things very easily, is, you know, I'd really be interested as an action item coming out of this, Heather, is, you know, to articulate how in hospitals we really should push for, you know, like in terms of looking at our value and supply chain for our food and moving towards a more kind of sustainable way. And I think that would be a great intersection. And we could put that in, you know, some medical journals, get people talking about that.
I would love to do that. So we could talk about this after, but just for those, the rest of the people who've joined us, if you're interested, if you're in the Ottawa area, as part of that, a brand new hospital is being built here. And one of the things is they're going to start with building the garage on the experimental farm and cutting down a bunch of forests. So already there, and again, that's municipal, you know, legal systems and developer law and all that kind of stuff. So that's very interesting. And certainly I'm on the Ottawa Food Policy Council, and others who've come to speak to us have said, wouldn't it be cool if the new hospital had, you know, a green roof where you could grow some food that people could eat, and even not only that, but patients who are able could even go and do a little bit of gardening that's so good for their mental and physical health too. So, and then put that in the cafeteria. But again, the power, the legally granted power to these huge corporations that provide institutional food like we have at the university, and I know is also the case at hospitals. So yeah, all of it for doctors and lawyers to work together on that would be so interesting.
Great.
Thank you,
Thanks.
Professor Simons, for that great question, and Dr. Moloo and Heather for those really wonderful responses. I think it gets us really thinking about responsibilities, like putting the social justice lens on planetary health. I think really at its core, planetary health has a focus on social justice and thinking about what are our responsibilities as a powerful nation, as, you know, institutions that hold a lot of power as well, to ensure that we are putting the needs and interests of those that are most impacted by the actions that that we've taken that have led to this planetary crisis, and to ensure that our solutions are focused around them. So we've got a couple more questions. I have one specifically for Dr. Moloo, and it's about whether the Ottawa Hospital and UOttawa have developed an approach to favoring use of reprocessed equipment or devices, despite some of the regulatory and legal hurdles that have to be overcome.
So it's a good question. Thanks. I would say there are certain things that are being reprocessed right now, but that would be the minority of what is used right now. It would be the short answer. The next part of that answer would be, we have a ton of work to do, and what we're really trying to do right now is really create that partnership with the Ottawa Hospital. Because again, even though I'm in both places, my position is with the Faculty of Medicine, and we're really trying to forge something where then we can have someone dedicated. Doesn't need to be me, but a sustainability officer. We have models, for example, at the University Health Network, where I think they are much more advanced in terms of they have a sustainability team with 8 people on it. We don't have one. So again, like, that speaks volumes then to the commitment of the organization to making these things happen. The other really interesting thing that's happened is this whole notion of a community of practice around this. And in Toronto, for example, now, all those affiliated hospitals at UHN, it's their CEOs who are coming to that table to talk about these issues because they're so big around all these, whether it's reprocessing equipment, whether, again, talking about procuring things in a sustainable fashion as a block. There is progress there and models to be seen, I think, and I really hope, and I have a meeting with one of the senior VPs later this afternoon. I'm really hoping we can move further ahead, but there's a lot of work to be done.
Great, thanks, Dr. Moloo. I think we have time for probably one or two more questions and then we'll wrap up. So I have a question about whether either of you are working with the economic faculties, so looking to better align economic and socioeconomic signals. Another
I'll answer
question
that
about
quickly because my answer
interdisciplinarity.
is, just as I mentioned at the end of my presentation, you know, as Heather and Tomas that reached out to me, I think that's an area I need to really improve. So no, nothing at my end, but I'm sure Heather has a different answer.
Well, no, so we invited, there's a chair of sustainability at the business school here that we invited, but they're on sabbatical. So absolutely, hopefully we'll have more of these. I mean, I think this is just the beginning of this conversation on campus, I hope, and even across campuses in other schools, but that's a crucial, it's a crucial piece of that. I know the business school is also moving, they're moving toward enhancing the sustainability offerings within the business school too, but it's an essential piece, and the economics department as well. It's very, very important. Through the Institute of the Environment, I know there are some economists who are definitely working on sustainability issues, but yeah, to work on the planetary health aspect is definitely something we need to do. Thank you.
Thank you both. So I think this is perhaps more of a comment, but to Professor Aguamanim, if it's a question, let me know if I'm not phrasing it properly, but he has said that Dr. Moloo, to both of you, I see a traction for entrenching planetary health approach across professional curricular, and imagine how this could be pushed forward with your current initiative, beginning from medicine and law. So I suppose you could speak briefly a little bit more about that, but I think this is a really great and encouraging point from Professor Aguamanim.
Yeah, thanks, Chidi. It's a great idea. I hope this is, as I say, just the beginning, and that creating this chair of planetary health is just the start.
Yeah, fully agree with that. Yeah, thanks for bringing that up.
You'd be a great part of it, Chidi. Professor Aguamanim is an amazing expert on Indigenous knowledge, on biotechnology, on food justice, etc. So he would be a huge part of that.
Wonderful. This is all very, very exciting. So I think this is probably a great point to end. I'm sorry to those of you whose questions we weren't able to get to in the chat, but we'll keep these on file perhaps for our next event, and we can think about engaging with them again then. I want to say thank you again to Dr. Moloo and Professor McLeod Kilmurray for this inspiring and very generative and hopeful conversation. And I want to say thank you also to the Center for Environmental Law and Global Sustainability, the Center for Health Law, Policy and Ethics, and the Faculty of Medicine for coordinating and supporting this event. And finally, thanks so much to all of you for attending and for participating today. I think really one of the key takeaways that we can take from both of the presentations and from this discussion is really the importance of bridging the gap between the environmental law community and the law community more broadly, and the medical community, and as we saw, increasingly across all disciplines when it comes to tackling the solutions to our ecological crisis. So I look forward to continued conversations and initiatives on planetary health between our faculties, and I wish you all a very wonderful afternoon and good health.